Hey everyone, and welcome back to Exposing SMG. Today we are going to talk about the new Archetypes podcast episode with Meghan Markle featuring Jameela Jamil and Shohreh Aghdashloo. The episode is titled The Audacity of the Activist, and right off the bat, I already know it's going to be annoying, but let's see if Meghan proves me wrong. She starts off with one of my favorite quotes: "If you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything." But I am already a little wary because Meghan often takes great things and turns them sour in her favor. So let's pray that this isn't another one of her revenge attempts on the royal family, where she throws shade at the policy that royals remain neutral and never really speak up. So less than a minute in, Meghan starts talking about how women in activism usually get what she calls a default eye roll, where people are like, oh, there she goes again with her activism.
Sit down and you know the rest. The unspoken annoyance.
Now, Meghan, if it's unspoken, who told you anyone is annoyed? Because as far as I'm concerned, women have been leading activist movements and getting shit done. I know this podcast isn't for uplifting women and instead is for highlighting the negative or the women can't do it attitude, but let's talk about women in activism for a second. Patrisse Cullors, Alicia Garza, and Opal Tometi formed the Black Lives Matter network in 2013, a huge movement that we see today backed up by so many high-profile people. Malala Yousafzai is a Pakistani female education activist, and she won the 2014 Nobel Peace Prize, making her the youngest winner in history. Greta Thunberg is a Swedish environmental activist who is known for challenging world leaders to take immediate action for climate change mitigation. She is only 19 years old, but she gave her iconic speech at 15. These are huge movements led and started by women, oftentimes women of color. Movements that I've seen grow and flourish. So what is Meghan getting at here by citing these unspoken annoyances? In an effort to find out when this so-called movement of annoying women activists started, she says that she read a piece on the term suffragette, and that is a term created by a journalist for a well-known UK publication. And then she goes on and says, I'm not going to mention the publication since it's still here today. There it is. If you guys don't know, our dear Meghan Markle is notorious for feuding with the tabloids, and her husband is notorious for saying that America's freedom of speech is bonkers.
I got so much I want to say about the First Amendment. I still don't understand it, but it is bonkers.
It is bonkers.
It's bonkers unless it's Meghan and Harry behind their twisted agenda, right? If it wasn't for freedom of speech, we wouldn't have to suffer weekly hearing Meghan Markle's breathy and dramatic podcast episodes. She starts talking about women in the suffrage movement, which was a decades-long fight to win the right to vote for women in the United States.
This term, this word, suffragette, which is a fraught term, was created by a journalist for a well-known UK publication, or shall I say tabloid.
Now, Meghan, girl, I know you aren't comparing the women's rights movement to the UK media calling you out or just writing about you the way they do to every other celebrity. But the fact that she is comparing female activism today in the modern world to something that started in 1848 and has completely elevated to a way where today we have a female vice president is very interesting to me. And you guys know my issue with her podcast. She brings on speakers that usually have a great story to tell, you know, when they are able to get in a few words without Meghan cutting them off and then inserting a long clip of her explaining what they were saying instead of actually letting us hear them talk. And then she uses this perfectly valid topic as a way to defend or excuse something that she has been exposed or criticized for. So as usual, your takeaway from this video shouldn't be the suffrage movement wasn't a big deal or that women don't go through hardships. But instead, it's that Meghan uses these important movements to feed her own agenda and promote the idea that women are oppressed in today's modern world, just so she can indirectly complain about the royal family and the UK media. Meghan wants to let the whole world think, or let me not give her that much credit for having that big of an audience, but she wants people who won't do their research to think, oh, poor Megs, she couldn't vocalize her opinion publicly when she married into the royal family, and now she's free. And again, she married into that family knowing how a royal should act, and obviously, tweeting the first thing that comes to mind or posting on Instagram isn't part of the job requirement that is expected of a working senior royal. But as we can see with the smart girl,
I was the smart one, I'm the smart one, I'm the smart one.
She doesn't grasp that. I give her some credit toward the end though, so keep watching to see why. Meghan then brings on Ilana Glazer, a comedian, organizer, activist, and Meghan talks about layering feminism in. Just like she hides her vegetables for her kids so they can eat them without knowing, but then tells us thank God that her perfect kids in her perfect fairy tale life love vegetables. To which Ilana's like, I don't believe in tricking kids, but yeah, thank God your kids love vegetables. You know when you bring in the gym teacher to teach math because of budget cuts? Yeah, that's what this podcast sounds like. Bringing in an unqualified person to talk about something, and listen, nothing against gym teachers, who knows, you're probably a gym teacher who's great at math. If so, let me know in the comments.
Can have chocolate or whatever, but it's like, actually don't hide the vegetables.
It's not a zero-sum game. I know. No, why do you have to hide it?
They're delicious.
At this point in her career, Ilana admittedly does.
And yeah, that's Meghan cutting her off. This just gives you guys a glimpse into the amount of times Meghan cuts off her guests. I don't include all those clips because then we'd be here for an extra hour. After that, there's a clip of Meghan explaining what Ilana does instead of letting Ilana tell us, and basically, Ilana runs this non-profit called Generator Collective, a place to talk about politics without feeling foolish. Meghan then inserts a clip of Ilana talking, and I kid you not, talking for like 8 seconds about living a message before a voiceover of Meghan is inserted where she tells us to her that means being bold and brave. And then the podcast is finally introduced. And this leaves me with one question. Does Meghan even know what she's talking about? Jameela Jamil is the first guest, and I personally love Jameela in The Good Place.
It was on called The Good Place, and I'd never
Which was a huge success and really catapulted you into stardom here. We binge watched it. We loved it.
And my character...
But as you guys know, I've run a celebrity blog for so many years, and I've talked about a lot of celebrities, Jameela being one of them because of her problematic activism in the past, especially when she was in the news a lot when journalist and founder of Vice's women's issues site Broadly, Tracy Egan Morrissey, called her out. It's a long story that can get a video on its own, but basically Jameela does throw a little shade on that situation. Now when it comes to guests, the theme in Meghan's podcast is that she likes pretending like the guests are her friends and that she has all these well-known celebrities in her inner circle.
Hello, my friend.
When that's not true. She often says, hello, friend, and I think this has to do with Paris Hilton telling her that she doesn't even know her during their podcast episode.
We haven't met before.
But I'm not too shocked that Jameela is on this episode because she has often defended Meghan and Harry in the most unhinged ways on Twitter. So of course, Meghan wants to recruit someone who already likes her so they can aid in her revenge agenda on the podcast. Jameela was always someone tweeting, Meghan and Harry are always thrown under the bus to cover a sex scandal for Andrew or Epstein. And this always annoys me when it's brought up because you can talk about both things and there is a time and place dedicated to each topic. For example, for me, I can't spend all my videos talking about dark Hollywood and trying to take down the industry's elite one video at a time. I mean, look at what happened to Epstein when he was this close to exposing all the names in the elite world who were tied to him. The media will always talk about everything with different types of media designated to different types of stories. One story doesn't contradict the other, but I digress. Jameela then talks about her journey with weight, women being criticized or assessed about weight, and the Instagram account she started for body positivity, and all the mental health advocacy she did, which is amazing. But then Meghan asks her to talk about her upbringing, specifically her childhood, which I felt came out of nowhere because Jameela kind of gets quiet and is like, I've had a tricky childhood.
Can you sort of explain what your childhood was like? This was always it was always an undercurrent.
I had a tricky childhood surrounded by a lot of mental illness and a lot.
She then talks about criticism when she would speak out about one topic and then she's bombarded by people telling her, well, why aren't you talking about this? And why aren't you talking about what's happening in this country and that country? And basically, she felt very overwhelmed by needing to cover everything, especially when she isn't that educated in all topics. And I love that she talked about that because it's an extremely valid point and it relates back to what I was saying about criticism that one person should cover all grounds, such as dark Hollywood topics like Epstein versus modern day gossip like Meghan and Harry. So in a way, Jameela contradicts her own past tweeting self, but she makes a great point, and it's something that I've seen stans on Twitter take part in when they harass their favorite celebrity to talk about XYZ and a million other things.
And I then would make mistakes that ended up causing more harm than good sometimes.
And you know, people often forget that a celebrity's job isn't always to advocate, considering the majority of them are kinda illiterate. And the last thing we need is someone who doesn't know anything talking about something that requires a lot of history and research. I mean, just look at where we are with Meghan. Jameela then makes a beautiful point about how she learned about her past mistakes and instead she puts her energy in places where she can be the most effective. And it's an amazing speech. Until Meghan says, "What does your partner think of that?"
I'm very deferential now to other experts outside of my...
What does your partner think of all this?
To which Jameela says that he's incredibly supportive of her. Like, obviously, what else is she going to say? I felt like it was such a weird direction to take the conversation, but then it sends Jameela into this wormhole where she takes on the spirit of an unhinged fan, talking about how her dynamic with her partner is similar to Meghan and Harry's and that she's so happy that Meghan and Harry have that same dynamic. And it's like, what do you know about Meghan and Harry's dynamic, Jameela? You said you only met Meghan twice.
I haven't seen you in, a year maybe now? We've seen each other twice ever? 3 times ever?
Yeah, twice ever.
Jameela then tells her that she's fought for her so many times on social media and says that Meghan has taken an unfathomable amount of shit and how this shows that people are afraid of her.
It's an unfathomable amount of shit that you take, Meghan. I can't believe it.
Yeah, people are afraid of her. Which is why the majority of her staff quit and people sent in bullying reports to her advisor. And the palace tried to keep everything under the rug, so it didn't reflect badly on them having royals bullying workers. But sure, let's give more fire to someone who has already stepped on the necks of the working class. Jameela then goes on this rant about how they are trying to make an example out of women, and they are using them to stop women from talking. And she's talking as if she's Malala Yousafzai, someone who was shot in the head on her way to school and then rose against a government to advocate for education. Jameela, girl, you were criticized by a journalist who called you out for discrepancies against statements you made about your own health. You know, it wasn't this big Marilyn Monroe government silencing conspiracy theory. Then she goes on a tangent about how men and women are treated differently, and she makes some great points again, but then she loses me when she says that people treat the earth badly because it's called Mother Earth and not some sort of patriarch figure. Anyway, in conclusion, Jameela made some great points and then some not very great points. Meghan then tries to make Jameela feed into her anti-social media vendetta because God forbid people can vocalize their thoughts, and she asks her that if she was advocating during the 70s or 80s, would it have been easier for her then versus now? To which Jameela's like, no, even though social media is toxic, so many great things have happened because of how fast people can be connected and how fast the word spreads, and calls social media extraordinary. So again, as you can see, Jameela makes great points and then Meghan just steers her in the other direction so she can continue proving her own random agenda. And she does this with a lot of guests. It's very tiring. Finally, we reach Shohreh Aghdashloo, who is an Iranian-American actress and activist. Now, I am very fond of this part of the podcast because Shohreh sheds light on what's going on in Iran, and I think that's important, especially if you don't know what's going on. I'd like that Meghan included this in her podcast, regardless of whatever agenda she comes up with, because at the end of the day, it is spreading awareness on what's happening in Iran. Women there are protesting the right to wear what they want, whether that's with the hijab or not, skinny jeans or not. And this came after the morality police arrested Mahsa Amini for not wearing her hijab correctly and wearing skinny jeans. She then died in the hospital from what many suspect were unfair beatings. May she rest in peace. All in all, this started up the protests. Now, the only issue I have with this part of the podcast was when Meghan says that it's emblematic to see a woman taking the hijab off and using it as a flag of swords, because it's ironically feeding into the stereotype that the hijab is oppressive and something that women want to take off. Meanwhile, that's not true, because while women are fighting for the right to take it off in Iran, other women are fighting for the right to keep it on in France. So it's important to highlight the issue of choice as opposed to feeding into the narrative that the hijab is oppressive and taking it off as a symbol of resistance or power. Meghan has a platform and it's important to highlight the issue here. You don't want someone listening to the podcast and the takeaway is that Iranian women are oppressed because they have to put on the hijab, something that is never highlighted by Shohreh. It's harmful to continue feeding the negative stereotype that Muslim women face, which is that all Muslims who wear the hijab are oppressed. This is where cultural versus religious differences arise, because what's happening in Iran isn't what's happening in the majority of other Muslim countries, nor should it be reduced to our Western standard of feminism. We don't want to advocate for one cause carelessly and not realize that in our carelessness, we are provoking issues for a different cause. Meghan doesn't even know what she's saying because she goes on and on about how she doesn't know if people can fully grasp how emblematic it is. And then she says to Shohreh, you might be able to speak to that in a way for people to understand that it's not just a strong image and visual, but it's a representative of something. What's the something, Meghan? Or are you trying to aid in a negative stereotype that many women face just because you couldn't take 2 minutes to research the history of a topic you are going to focus 20 minutes on? So that's what bothered me, because that's not what Shohreh chooses to focus on. Instead, she emphasizes that they are being killed for their basic rights and that is the right to choose. The freedom of religion, the choice whether or not to practice something. Shohreh educates us that it's not just the death of a 22-year-old, but it's 43 years of dictatorship in Iran, religious tyranny, misogyny, embezzlement from the Iranian people, and so much more. And then Meghan asks her question, how is your generation different from today's generation? You know, trying to feed the same old social media is bad narrative. But Shohreh is like, this generation's incredible because they know English better. They know how to use the internet, and words spread super fast, and basically just goes on and on about how helpful social media is when it comes to advocating. Something that Jameela Jamil also said. Meanwhile, Meghan's entire narrative is trying to silence those on social media from speaking out against bullies like her or bullies in the government. After Shohreh says all that, Meghan just says one word. Wow. She ends the podcast with how the words feminism and woke are treated as taboo, and she talks about feeding into the clickbait, and then asks the question, what is so scary about a woman having an opinion as strongly as a man does? And I feel like Meghan continues to make these man versus women comparisons for I don't know what reason, because the entire point of the podcast gets shoved under the rug. And if you are going to give a class on gender studies, then do it. But again, I don't understand why she wants to reduce the hardships that women go through to make a comparison between men. I really will never understand. So that concludes my full review and recap of this podcast episode. Be sure to let me know what you think in the comments below. If you guys want me to keep making these review and recap videos, let me know and I'll keep doing them. Now that there's been a handful of Archetypes episodes out, what do you think about the podcast so far? I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Follow us on our social media, like and subscribe for more, and as always, I'll see you next time.